October 6, 1943. Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. The sea is as black as tar, swallowed by an impenetrable blanket of clouds. A Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, slices through the night at 30 knots, its engines thundering. The crew smokes casually on deck, unaware that this peaceful evening will soon turn to chaos. Then radar contact, 800 yards off the port. Something small, something fast. Probably debris, someone mutters. But that radar return moves faster than anything that should be there. And suddenly, 3 streaks of white foam cut through the water like claws in the night. Torpedoes. And behind them, an 80-foot silhouette charges head-on at 40 knots. The destroyer's guns open fire, but they're too slow. In less than 90 seconds, the sea erupts. Explosions, screams, chaos. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about naval warfare was shattered in those moments. The attackers aren't cruisers. They aren't submarines. They're patrol torpedo boats, plywood, gasoline, and raw American audacity. Small, expendable, and until that night, dismissed as mere nuisance weapons. But that night, the nuisance became a nightmare. The Japanese destroyers never expected this. They designed their ships for armor and artillery, but not for speed, not for chaos. Because at 40 knots, the rules of the sea no longer applied. It's easy to forget how desperate the Pacific looked for America in 1942. Japan's navy stretched from Burma to the Marshall Islands, an empire floating on steel. Every island they captured became a fortress, every strait a death trap. The U.S. Navy had power. Yes, battleships, carriers, destroyers, but none could operate close to the beachheads. The coral reefs and shallow channels made the giants useless. The Navy needed something small enough to vanish into the mangroves, fast enough to strike and disappear before the enemy could react. But there was another problem: the men. After Pearl Harbor, thousands of young Americans wanted vengeance, yet the Navy didn't have enough ships for them to fight on. So, in a desperate move, the Navy turned to a strange idea. What if we built hundreds of tiny boats, cheap, fast, disposable, and filled the ocean with them? The admirals called it the Patrol Torpedo Program. On paper, it looked ridiculous. A wooden boat carrying 4 torpedoes, no armor, no protection, barely any range. But the Navy had no choice. They needed something that could fight in the island maze. And so, America gambled on plywood. They weren't built from steel, they were carved from desperation. In 1942, 2 American companies, Elco in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Higgins Industries in New Orleans, began competing to design the Navy's new weapon. Elco had experience with luxury yachts. Higgins built swamp boats for the bayous. Neither was known for warfare. But that was the point. The Navy didn't need tradition. It needed innovation. The result looked more like a racing yacht than a warship, 80 feet long, made almost entirely of layered mahogany. At first glance, it seemed absurd: wood instead of armor, gasoline instead of diesel, and a hull so thin you could punch through it with a wrench. Each boat carried 4 torpedoes, a pair of 50 caliber machine guns, and sometimes an Oerlikon 20mm cannon bolted to the deck. The crew? 12 men barely out of their teens packed into a floating bomb. Conditions were brutal. Gasoline fumes choked the air. Tropical humidity soaked everything. If an enemy shell hit the boat, it didn't sink, it exploded. That's why the men gave them a nickname the Navy hated: the plywood coffins. But these men weren't ordinary sailors. They were volunteers, adrenaline junkies, racers, engineers, and dreamers who wanted to do something that mattered. And they believed that speed could be a kind of armor. Still, the early missions were humiliating. The Mark 8 torpedoes they carried were relics from World War I. Slow, unreliable, often misfiring or running too deep to hit anything. More than once, PT boats launched their full spread of torpedoes, only to watch them vanish harmlessly into the dark. To the Japanese, these mosquito boats were laughable. To the American Navy, they were starting to look like a failed experiment. But in Detroit, a storm was brewing that would change everything. What if you gave a speedboat to the heart of a fighter plane? That was the question engineers at the Packard Motor Company asked in 1942. Packard had already built high-performance engines for racing cars and aircraft. Even the legendary P-51 Mustang used their power plants. So when the Navy came calling, Packard's engineers didn't hesitate. They took their Rolls-Royce Merlin-derived V12 engine, stripped it down, and rebuilt it for the sea. The result was a 12-cylinder, 1,350 horsepower marine engine compact, liquid-cooled, and roaring like a beast. Now imagine 3 of those engines, mounted side by side on a single 80-foot wooden hull. Together, they produced over 4,000 horsepower, enough to propel a PT boat across the water at 41 knots. That's nearly 47 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun its own torpedoes. At that speed, the sea itself became a weapon. Spray blasted over the bow, engines screamed in harmony, and the fragile wooden hull shuddered as if alive. To the men on board, it was intoxicating, like flying just above the water. But speed alone wasn't enough. The Navy had to learn how to turn these fragile, volatile machines into destroyer killers. That meant new tactics, new training, and a new kind of sailor, one who wasn't afraid to gamble everything on instinct and timing. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy still believed that war was won by tonnage and tradition. Their destroyers, like the Kajo class and Fubuki class, were heavily armored, bristling with 5-inch guns and long-range, long-lance torpedoes. They had no reason to fear wooden boats. Not yet. But the moment Packard's engines hit the water, the balance of power began to shift. For the first time in the Pacific, a $10,000 boat could threaten a $10 million destroyer. And soon, those wooden coffins would start punching holes in the Empire's pride. The Japanese Navy fought by the book. The men of the PT boats, they burned the book. For decades, the Imperial Navy had trained for one glorious moment, the decisive battle, the legacy of Tsushima, when Japan's mighty fleet crushed the Russians in 1905. Still haunted every Japanese admiral. They believed wars were won by grand clashes between giants, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, not by mosquito-sized raiders darting through the night. By 1942, that doctrine shaped everything they built. Their destroyers were massive, powerful, and perfectly designed for fleet combat. But as Japan expanded deeper into the Pacific, those same destroyers were reassigned to a humiliating new job running supplies. The Americans called these nightly missions the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers carried crates of rice, ammunition, and fuel to starving island garrisons. They traveled under the cover of darkness, hugging the coastlines of places like New Georgia and Kolombangara. It was a deadly routine until the PT boats arrived. Armed with radar and speed, the Americans began using wolf pack-style ambushes. They learned to operate like guerrillas of the sea. One PT boat would rush in and draw enemy fire, lighting up the destroyer's guns. Meanwhile, another would circle wide, glide into torpedo range, and unleash its strike before vanishing into the black. To the Japanese, it was chaos, unpredictable, irrational, and terrifying. Their doctrine couldn't explain it. Their training didn't prepare them for it. They had been taught that victory belonged to the largest ship with the biggest guns, but now, the ocean's deadliest hunters were being stalked by plywood phantoms. At first, Tokyo dismissed reports of PT attacks as exaggerated. They called the boats midget pests, or mosquitoes of the sea. But those mosquitoes were multiplying. Every failed mission taught the Americans something new, a new angle, a new trick, a faster escape route. By mid-1943, PT squadrons had become the eyes and fangs of the U.S. Navy in the Solomon Islands. They prowled the same channels that destroyers once ruled, turning the night sea into a hunting ground. And for the Japanese, the darkness that once protected them had turned against them. October 6th, 1943. The Solomon Islands, a graveyard of ships. Locals called it Iron Bottom Sound, a name earned by the hundreds of wrecks littering the ocean floor. Every night, the sea swallowed more steel, and tonight would be no different. At midnight, 4 American PT boats waited in ambush. PT-59, PT-157, PT-162, and PT-170. They were part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9, stationed near Vella La Vella. Their orders were simple: intercept any destroyer moving through the Tokyo Express supply line. But simple orders rarely stayed simple once the ocean turned black. The night was suffocatingly dark. No moon, no horizon, just the hum of Packard engines idling low, like the growl of predators ready to strike. Every man aboard was tense, eyes glued to the radar screen that flickered with faint echoes. And then, there it was, fast-moving blips, signatures too large for barges, too fast for transports. Destroyers. The Americans knew what that meant. Within minutes, those destroyers would unleash 5-inch shells and spotlights, bright enough to turn night into day. But instead of retreating, the PT boats crept forward. They throttled down, skimming silently across the surface, 800 yards, 600, 400. On PT 170, Lieutenant Robert Owens gave the order: Fire 1, Fire 2. 2 torpedoes sliced into the darkness, their wakes glowing faintly white. Seconds later, PT 162 followed. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the sea exploded. A wall of fire shot skyward. The Japanese destroyer Yugure, nearly 3,000 tons of steel lifted out of the water and broke in half. Her bow and stern sank within minutes, taking more than 200 crewmen with her. The entire engagement lasted 26 minutes. When the flames died, silence returned, broken only by the crackle of burning oil. 12 men on a wooden boat had just sunk one of the Emperor's destroyers. Back at base, few believed the report at first. Even in victory, it sounded like fantasy plywood versus armor, 12 men versus 200. But wreckage doesn't lie. That night, the PT boats proved something that neither side had truly believed possible: that speed, coordination, and nerve could beat raw firepower. And somewhere in the dark, the ocean seemed to whisper a new law of war: that courage could outrun steel. After the destruction of the Yugure, something shifted in the Pacific. For the first time, Japanese destroyer captains began to fear the dark. They were no longer sailing through empty seas, they were sailing through ghosts. Every wake on the water could be a PT boat. Every flicker of phosphorescence might be the glow of a torpedo's trail. Reports began flooding into Japanese headquarters. Destroyers were cutting their engines mid-route, terrified of detection. Convoys slowed to a crawl. Some ships even hugged the coast so tightly they risked running aground anything to avoid the American mosquitoes. The Tokyo Express that once thundered through the night began limping. Every supply run took longer. Every loss hurts more. The psychological toll was enormous. Destroyer captains started firing blindly into the darkness, burning precious ammunition on shadows and waves. Searchlights swept across the sea, desperate for a glimpse of an enemy that rarely stayed visible for more than a few seconds. But the moment a searchlight flicked on, it became a beacon for the PT boats, marking exactly where to strike. And then there was the hunger. With the supply lines collapsing, Japanese island garrisons began to starve. Entire outposts went without food or medicine for weeks. It wasn't the PT boats' torpedoes that destroyed them. It was isolation. The PT crews knew it too. Every mission they launched wasn't just an attack, it was another thread cut from Japan's vast but fragile web. The more they struck, the more the empire bled. Quietly, invisibly. In war, fear is often more powerful than firepower. And by 1944, that fear had spread across every Japanese destroyer deck. They called the night sea mosquito waters, a place where small wooden boats moved faster than logic, faster than death itself. At 40 knots, America had turned the tide of the Pacific not through brute force, but through ingenuity and audacity. And from that point on, Japan's empire of steel was being eaten alive, one wooden bite at a time. They called them plywood coffins. But history would remember them as something else, the wooden warriors who changed naval warfare forever. The PT boats didn't win the Pacific alone. They couldn't stand toe-to-toe with battleships, and they never claimed to. Their legacy wasn't measured in the number of ships they sank. It was in the fear they created, the tactics they inspired, and the spirit they embodied. By 1944, the Japanese Navy had been forced to adapt. Destroyers were now guarded by spotter planes and escorts. Convoys sailed shorter distances. And every night, every sound of an engine on the horizon made men wonder, is that another PT boat? The Navy that once laughed at them had learned respect the hard way. For the Americans, these wooden boats became schools of innovation. They tested new radar systems, torpedo guidance, improvements, and hit-and-run tactics that would later evolve into modern fast-attack craft doctrine. Decades later, their DNA could be found in everything from Vietnam swift boats to today's littoral combat ships, small, modular, and fast. But the story of the PT boats isn't just about engineering. It's about courage. Men who volunteered for impossible odds, who fought in the dark with no armor, and who knew that one lucky shell could end it all. Yet, they climbed aboard anyway. Because courage, like speed, doesn't need armor. And among those men was one who would one day sit in the White House. John F. Kennedy, skipper of PT 109. When his boat was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer, he didn't surrender. He swam miles through shark-infested waters to save his crew, proving again that the PT boats weren't built for glory, they were built for grit. By the war's end, over 500 pints boats had served across every corner of the Pacific. Most were burned, or scrapped after victory. Wood rots fast. But legacy doesn't. Even now, divers in Iron Bottom Sound sometimes find fragments, splinters of mahogany still clinging to rusted torpedo tubes. Reminders of a time when 12 men and a wooden hull could rewrite the rules of the ocean. In the end, Japan's destroyers learned a brutal truth. Power means nothing if you can't adapt. While the empire measured its strength in tons of steel, America measured it in ideas, speed, agility, and nerve. The PT boats were never supposed to work. But they did, because the men who built and sailed them refused to believe they couldn't. That's the real lesson of the PT squadrons, not that small boats sank big ships, but that innovation can outmaneuver arrogance. Every wake they left behind carried a message. Victory doesn't belong to the biggest. It belongs to the fastest, to adapt. Somewhere in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands, beneath the waves of Iron Bottom Sound, that message still echoes a faint roar of 3 Packard engines, tearing through the blackness at 40 knots. And if you listen closely, you might still hear it, the sound of courage outrunning steel.